The Rings of Power has been, overall, a bit of a disappointment, especially considering all the hype that was surrounding it. Since then, fans have been hoping that the Lord of the Rings director Peter Jackson could possibly save the series because he was the person who made the franchise successful. But the show is already at its 8th episode, so can he really switch it up now? Well, that's exactly what we'll be looking into in today's video. First up, can Jackson fix Rings of Power? By this point, it should be obvious that despite its huge budget, Lord of the Rings of Power has failed to live up to the hype. Although it's debatable whether the show has actually failed, the majority of fans and the majority of online discussion forums have all had negative things to say about it. Some even went so far as to start a petition on change.org, pleading for Amazon to hand the show over to Peter Jackson, the renowned director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, in order for him to save the upcoming seasons. Tolkien fans are particularly annoyed by the Rings of Power's treatment of their favorite fantasy universe, but even they know this petition is completely pointless. And even if, by some miracle, the petition actually does get attention, then what are the chances that Amazon will actually listen to it? Can Peter Jackson improve the Rings of Power after the first season has already established a specific plot and characterization? The realistic answer is that he probably can't. In fact, Jackson actually had a similar experience, and the results weren't very promising. He took over the Hobbit film trilogy from Guillermo del Toro at an early stage of development, before the filming had even started. However, that trilogy is known for being inferior to Jackson's work on The Lord of the Rings. While Jackson made some questionable creative decisions, the time constraints and studio pressure almost certainly played a huge role in the movie's failure. Plus, it happened when Jackson took over a project in its early stages from a director who had previously communicated with him. Coming up, why wasn't Jackson involved in the first place? Screenwriters Patrick McKay and John Payne were asked in the Vanity Fair interview if the show would be similar to The Lord of the Rings, to which they replied that their new story would be different but familiar, something many fans have already noticed even in the 60 seconds of footage that we received for the first trailer. This makes sense given that the legendary movie and the future series aren't officially part of the same cinematic world. Vanity Fair writer Joanna Robinson even mentions it, writing, "It's worth remembering, if only for legal reasons, that this is not the exact same world. The production design, though similar, is not trying to match the Jackson films." Payne later explained exactly why Jackson never actually got involved in the project at all. Apparently, it was his schedule that just didn't align with making the Rings of Power. They said that they reached out to Jackson, but it was during COVID and he had a lot of projects lined up at the time. They couldn't even go out for coffee or anything, but they did mention that they'd love to work with him in the future. This doesn't say much about the type of get-together the showrunners were looking for. Did they expect Jackson to participate? Or were they just interested in getting his input on all things Tolkien? Still, even if that wasn't possible because of scheduling conflicts, Jackson's absence from the bigger project makes sense. Next up, Rings of Power doesn't even acknowledge Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies. J.R.R. Bayona, director of The Lord of the Rings of Power, clarifies how the show was inspired by Peter Jackson's films and why they'll probably never even acknowledge them. Jackson's cinematic trilogy, which was released in 2001 to 2003 as an epic adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's seminal Lord of the Rings novel, completely changed fantasy on the big screen and set the bar incredibly high for future adaptations, which even Jackson himself wasn't able to live up to with his later Hobbit trilogy. Jackson has since moved on from Middle-earth to work on other projects. Rings of Power, which will premiere on Prime Video on September 2nd, will be Amazon's first foray into Middle-earth. The Internet Corporation paid $250 million for the television rights to Lord of the Rings in 2017, and quickly dedicated all of its time to making the Rings of Power, which would cost a whopping $1 billion to produce. This made it the most expensive TV series ever filmed. J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay of Star Trek Beyond were hired as showrunners, with Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom's J.R.R. Bayona directing the first 2 episodes. Rings of Power, unlike Jackson's direct adaptations, is actually based on Tolkien's Lord of the Rings appendices, which feature a discussion of the Second Age. During a recent interview with SFX magazine, Bayona spoke about how they were inspired by Jackson's films. According to the director, the original plan was to establish a bridge between the show and the movies, but they quickly found themselves unconsciously separating from the movies in order to present their own independent storyline. Moving on, they never even consulted with Jackson. Bayona's statements show that Rings of Power probably won't make any significant connection to the Lord of the Rings films. This might also explain why Rings of Power never even consulted with Jackson before making Rings of Power. The show technically can't be considered a direct prequel to the Lord of the Rings film trilogy because of a stipulation in Amazon's deal with the Tolkien estate. But since Payne, McKay, and Bayona had a lot of admiration for Jackson's movies, they still couldn't help but evoke his films with similar production designs and other creative choices. While Rings of Power has grown somewhat further away from Jackson's films than was initially intended, the show will still basically work as a prequel, despite the fact that rights difficulties keep it from being one in name. The series will delve into several Middle-earth origin legends, including the creation of the fabled Rings of Power and the birth of the Dark Lord Sauron, as well as the reappearance of younger versions of Galadriel and Elrond. Tolkien lovers are in for a real treat with The Lord of the Rings: The Rings of Power. Now let's look at what a Rings of Power prequel series set in the First Age could look like. There's still a lot that has to happen before the Fellowship of the Peter Jackson movies and J.R.R. Tolkien is made. But The Rings of Power isn't only about how the events of today will form the grim future that lies ahead. It's also about how the show's major characters are haunted by their history. We barely get a glimpse of the First Age in the prologue, but it paints a vivid image of the horror and destruction Galadriel experienced during the struggle against Morgoth. There are also flashbacks of the Elven warrior's childhood in Valinor, before the murder of her brother Finrod and her mission to find and defeat Sauron. Tolkien created several stories about this place as well as Valinor, where elves were thought to live in eternal happiness beyond the sundering seas. First up, Galadriel's story. Galadriel is a very important character on the show and in Tolkien's books, whose narrative spans all of these distinct times and places. Galadriel was born in the Years of the Trees, which predates even the First Age, and she sees a lot of Middle-earth during her life. And while she wasn't actually a famous warrior in Tolkien's original novels, The Rings of Power changes her past, putting her on the front line during the War of Wrath. This gave her a more active position in the Lord of the Rings lore than ever before. There's still so much Middle-earth history to discover with Galadriel, based on both Tolkien and the show's backstory. You could build a whole First Age prequel story out of her time in Valinor and Beleriand, the countless battles she fought against Morgoth's army, her encounter with Elrond, and her marriage to Celebrimbor. In fact, when Den of Geek asked actor Morfydd Clark whether she'd be interested in starring in her own prequel spin-off, she was excited about the opportunity as well as the stories she'd want to see explored. Finally, Melian and Thingol. Clark mentioned she'd love to see the love story of an elven king who is captivated by a lovely singing Maya. While Galadriel has no role in Thingol and Melian's marriage, Tolkien does mention that Galadriel and her brother Finrod spent time at their court in Beleriand when they arrived in Middle-earth from Valinor in the First Age. That would definitely make an interesting setup for a prequel series. It could also lead to other fan-favorite stories that we haven't gotten to see on screen yet, like The Legend of Beren and Luthien, a story of forbidden love between a man and an elf that connects directly to the Silmarils, the magical jewels only hinted at in the Rings of Power. That's a wrap for today's video. Do you think Jackson could save the Rings of Power? Make sure to let us know in the comments down below. As always, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and click the subscribe button for more videos like this one. We'll see you next time.